Spoštovane dame, spoštovani gospodje, cenjeni udeleženci in udeleženke, dragi gostje. Dobrodošli na tretjem zaključnem dnevu festivala Retrofest 2024. Današnji dan bo otvorila častna govorka Marie-Janine Calic, profesorica zgodovine vzhodne in jugovzhodne Evrope na Univerzi v Münchnu, kjer je bila med drugim tudi dekanja Fakultete za zgodovino in umetnosti. Pogosto je gostovala tudi na drugih univerzah. Med drugim je ravnokar zaključila gostovanje na Harvardski univerzi, bila pa je tudi gostujoča profesorica na College of Europe. Predtem je delovala kot znanstvena svetnica na Nemškem inštitutu za mednarodne in varnostne študije v Berlinu. Poleg pedagoškega in raziskovalnega dela je imela tudi nekatere druge vloge, ki pomembno vplivajo na zakonodajo in družbo. Med drugim je bila med letoma 1999 in 2002 politična svetovalka posebnega koordinatorja za pakt stabilnosti v jugovzhodni Evropi v Bruslju. Hkrati pa je sodelovala na in svetovala sedežu Unproforja v Zagrebu in Mednarodnemu sodišču za vojne zločine na območju nekdanje Jugoslavije s sedežem v Hagu. Središče njenega raziskovalnega dela je Balkan. Njegov rezultat pa so številne publikacije, med njimi kar 100 znanstvenih člankov, pa tudi številne knjige, med njimi Zgodovina Jugoslavije, objavljena leta 2018, Socialna zgodovina Srbije, objavljena leta 2004, ter Vojna in mir v Bosni in Hercegovini, objavljena leta 1996. Njena zadnja knjiga z naslovom Zgodovina Balkana je bila v obliki priročne knjižice izdana leta 2023. Dve njeni knjigi pa sta prevedeni tudi v slovenščino. Prva je Zgodovina jugovzhodne Evrope iz leta 2019, v izvirniku sicer izdana že leta 2016. Ta je med drugim tudi del obvezne literature na Oddelku za zgodovino Filozofske fakultete Univerze v Ljubljani. Druga pa je pravkar prevedena biografija Tito, večni partizan, izvorno objavljena leta 2020, ki jo boste lahko po zaključku predavanja in pogovora tudi kupili. Izjemno veseli smo, da lahko med nami pozdravimo profesorico Calic in prisluhnemo njenemu predavanju z naslovom Tito, Jugoslavija in ideja novega svetovnega reda. Miss Calic, the stage is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, I'm very happy to be here. It's a big pleasure and an honor to open today's discussion about foreign policy and international developments. Tito is one of the most interesting and extraordinary figures in contemporary history. He's also a very controversial one. A hero and a partisan leader for the one side and a peacemaker, and a dictator and a mass murderer for the other side. Whatever one might think about his rule, one thing is clear. Tito made Yugoslavia a well-respected and influential country globally. There are thousands of publications about Tito and Tito's Yugoslavia, including two more recent biographies, one by Jože Pirjevec and one by Slavko and Ivo Goldstein. Both books are tremendously impressive. I admire both, and I owe them a great deal. My book has a more modest approach. It is directed to a mainly German audience, and it is part of the series by the Institute of Contemporary History in Munich, the Institute of Zeitgeschichte. The series is called Dictators in the 20th Century. The aim was to analyze biographies of several autocratic rulers, or dictators, if you so wish, from a comparative perspective, including figures like Mussolini, Stalin, Mugabe, and also Tito. Center stage of my book are forms and functions of Tito's rule and the evolution of his way of governance. Since I wrote the book for a German audience in the first place, Tito's relationship with Germany was examined in more detail. The book reveals some unknown facts about his marriage to a German communist in Moscow, but also about his role in Willy Brandt's new Ostpolitik. I paid particular attention to the international context and the relationship between foreign and domestic policy, which I claim was one of the stabilizers of the Yugoslav socialist system. There were other stabilizers too, but they are not the topic of today's lecture. Recent years have seen renewed interest in Yugoslavia's foreign policy. Tvrtko Jakovina is here. I know that Jože Pirivec is researching non-alignment, Svetozar Rajak, and many others. They all have studied Yugoslavia's politics of non-alignment, and there's also new literature from a global history perspective. For instance, about global socialism, research by James Mark and his collaborators, about socialist development policy in the third world, global public sphere, and other topics. Today, I will explore why Yugoslavia became so interested in world politics at a certain moment, how it envisioned a just international order, and which strategies it used to promote it. I will go in 3 steps. Hopefully. First, I will outline the broader context of the Cold War and some basic principles of Yugoslavia's foreign policy, paying particular attention to the principle of active peaceful coexistence and the non-aligned movement. Second, I will look into Yugoslavia's approach to European security, including the German question. And third, initiatives for a new economic and information order within the UN system and within UNESCO. There is so far very little research on this new information order. This is why I picked this topic, which I also pushed forward research on it during my stay in Harvard last year. So there's something new which is not in my book. The origins of Tito's foreign policy can be traced back to the early days of World War II. From 42 onwards, the partisans were trying to establish relations with both the Soviet Union and the British, the Western Allies. And the British were in fact the first to send a military mission on the ground during the partisan struggle. However, in 1944, the big three, the Allies, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, met in Yalta, and they agreed to divide Europe in spheres of interest. You see here the famous 50-50, so-called 50-50 agreement. This is a note by Churchill, his personal handwriting, an agreement which he apparently made with Stalin. Eastern Europe should fall into Stalin's sphere of interest. Greece should fall into the British one. But as for Yugoslavia, it was agreed that neither the West nor the East should have dominance in this very important strategic country. Yugoslavia, due its strategic position, should play the role of a buffer state. And indeed, after the war, Yugoslavia's neutrality became an important element in European security. And by the way, in particular also in NATO's defense strategy. Having been shut out of the Common Forum in 48 and the Comecon in 49, Yugoslavia was dangerously isolated. Tito had to redefine both the political system and her foreign policy orientation. Now, as for the political system, we talk about self-management and socialism, a so-called socialism with a human face, a more liberal system. But foreign policy was a complement to this new model. Tito exploited the 50-50 agreement very skillfully and cooperated with the West as well as with the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. Because both superpowers subsequently made great efforts to gain Tito's goodwill, including through loans and economic cooperation, so that Yugoslavia should not drift into the enemy camp during the Cold War. In 1954, Yugoslavia launched a new doctrine for its security and foreign policy. It was called the Doctrine of Active Global Coexistence. A doctrine and a policy that should guarantee Yugoslavia's independence and territorial integrity, which felt very threatened at the time during the Cold War by the two nuclear powers, and non-interference by either of the two superpowers. For the Yugoslavs, peaceful coexistence was not a simple defense of the status quo, as developed by Khrushchev and the Soviet Union in the years after '56, but as Tito underlined, a dynamic, progressive process, one which should help to overcome the divisions of the Cold War and should lead to a gradual elimination of blocs. This principle of active coexistence became so important to Yugoslavia's political identity that it became enshrined in its 1963 constitution. Active, peaceful coexistence developed out of Yugoslavia's vital national interests. Interest first was to safeguard Yugoslavia's sovereignty and independence outside the bloc by establishing the principle of non-interference. Second, to preserve its state borders. The state borders drawn after '45, in particular rejecting Italian claims on Istria. And third, to seize an opportunity for Yugoslavia to prove itself as a proactive agent of moderation and mediation in Cold War politics. Not the least, through foreign policy, Tito wanted to win more capital internationally and credibility, and so he was also able to use this new foreign policy to create legitimacy for his rule. In the first years of his presidency, Tito frequently traveled with his state yacht, Galeb. He sought allies in the so-called Third World, where, as a result of decolonization, many countries were in a similar situation than Yugoslavia. They were newly independent, they feared interference by the big powers, and they feared to lose their independence to one of the blocs. Between 1944 and 1970, 64 states proclaimed independence in the wake of decolonization. There were 17 countries in Africa alone in 1960. And Tito tried to travel and visit all these newly independent states. He went with his Galeb to India, to Burma. He traveled to the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, Egypt, and several Asian countries in 1958. He also became the first leader of a communist country to visit Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. Incredibly enough, from 1944 until 1980, Tito made 169 official visits to 92 countries. He spent almost 1,000 days abroad, and apparently he was never afraid that while being out of the country there could be a coup d'etat against him. During his travels, Tito granted loans worth billions, clearing contracts, and technical and military aid. He was happy to visit factories, hospitals, and schools that had been built with the help of Yugoslav companies. This promised international influence and prestige, and increased in legitimacy and stability as home. It also provided for new forms of a personality cult, because his trips were also a huge spectacle. They were staged in the public space and broadcast by the media. Tito had always a couple of photographers taking along on his trips, and there is a huge amount of photographs, all his visits today in Belgrade, which can be used. He was the only one in the world, as Serbian writer Dobrica Ćosić found, who allowed the people to participate in foreign policy in such a demonstrative manner and in such large numbers in order to strengthen his international reputation. That was Tito's direction, of course, said Ćosić, but a very effective one. The non-aligned movement became Tito's signature project, which he developed in cooperation with other statesmen, namely Prime Minister of India Nehru and Egyptian Prime Minister Gamal Abdel Nasser. As is well known, following the conference in Bandung in 1955, Tito invited Nasser and Nehru on the island of Brioni, and in 1961 to a big international conference in Belgrade, where the non-aligned movement was constituted. In the following years, Tito transformed the non-aligned states into allies and rallied them behind his third way in Cold War. In 1974, the movement had grown to hundreds of members, including countries in Latin America, Asia, and many of them in Africa. But Yugoslavia's foreign policy did not focus only on the new independent states outside Europe. And this brings me to my second point, the European security issue. In the framework of active coexistence, European security appeared high on Yugoslavia's agenda at an early stage. Tito understood that the key to solving European security issues and overcoming the divisions of the Cold War was the German question. He considers the rapprochement between West Germany and the GDR is key to overcoming the dynamics of bipolarity. Tito told Khrushchev in 1955 already, I quote, he believed the question of resolving the German question is closely bound with the question of European security at the same time. The establishment of diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union in 1957 led Tito to recognize the GDR in diplomatic terms, and this created a problem with West Germany, because West Germany wanted unification and considered itself as, or the two Germanys as one Germany, and of course the leadership in future unification process. But so they were very critical when Tito recognized the GDR, which was the prize for normalizing relations with the Soviet Union. Tito maintained it was not Yugoslavia's fault that Germany was divided, but a big power's decision, which they had just to cope with. Yet the Federal Republic, in accordance with its newly enunciated so-called Hallstein Doctrine, broke off diplomatic relations with Yugoslavia immediately, insisting on Western Germany's right to represent the interests of Germany as a whole, meaning also including the GDR. Nevertheless, in spite of diplomatic isolation, so-called diplomatic isolation by Western Germany, economic ties developed favorably. In spite of some persisting contentious issues, in particular the one on compensation for war damages which Yugoslavia claimed from Germany, which was unresolved. Good neighborly relations were fostered by a growing number of Yugoslav so-called guest workers, migrant workers coming to Germany, and German tourists coming to Yugoslavia. In 1966, when the government in West Germany changed and Willy Brandt became foreign minister and then chancellor, and when Willy Brandt developed his new Ostpolitik, Yugoslavia suddenly appeared as a kind of natural ally for West Germany in the detente process, but also with regard to unification, because Tito had said unification was the key to overcoming bipolarity. And this view was shared by Willy Brandt and the new government. Ostpolitik promoted a direct communication and engagement between Western and Eastern between the West and Eastern communist neighbors, and the normalization of relations between Western Germany and the GDR. It recognized realities of ideological and political split in order to facilitate peaceful change in the long run, and using the means of diplomacy, trade, and human contacts. Considering Yugoslavia's international position between East and West, Willy Brandt in January 1967 insisted on normalizing relations with Yugoslavia, leaving behind the Hallstein Doctrine. And indeed, in January 1968, diplomatic relations between West Germany and Yugoslavia were resumed. Many documents in the German Foreign Ministry underlined how important they considered Tito in the framework of the new Ostpolitik. Not the least because of his privileged yet independent relations with Moscow, but also because he had a strong voice in the non-aligned world. Indeed, the new Ostpolitik and Tito's non-alignment policy developed in parallel, and there were certain interrelations. Both policies set a new tone and challenged the superpower's hegemony throughout Europe and the so-called Third World. In 1968, the Hallstein sanctions were lifted, while Bonn, under the so-called Brioni formula, when Willy Brandt visited Tito, proposed a loan of 300 million Deutschmark under very generous conditions instead of war reparations. So the issue was to deal with the past in a way that Germany would not officially recognize that it had to pay war damage, but Germany wanted to help Yugoslavia. Willy Brandt said he wanted to do something forward-looking to the future and support Yugoslavia's development by granting rather generous loans, development aid by Western Germany to Yugoslavia amounted up to 1 billion Deutschmarks. From now on, the German question took a new dimension, and Yugoslavia was considered to be very helpful in that because it had the contact to Moscow, it had a strong voice in the United Nations as well. This is a different story, but in 1972, indeed, relations between the two Germanys were normalized. They did not recognize each other, or West Germany did not recognize the GDR, but found a pragmatic way to re-establish relations and improve human contacts and other practical issues. At the same time, the Yugoslavs, like the Soviets, strove for a new European security order. Soviet leaders had asked as early as 1954 for an international conference that would solidify the borders drawn after 1945 in Europe, and thus finalize the division of Europe in two zones of interest. And not only interest, zones of authority and practice. In March 1970, Yugoslavia presented its own proposal. A memorandum on what is called Problems of Security and Cooperation in Europe. In 1968, Soviet invasion in Czechoslovakia had renewed the sense of urgency for a strong security regime against external threats. And Yugoslavia felt it was vulnerable because of its critical strategic position, in particular in view of the constant threat of a possible Soviet invasion in the country. Yugoslavia's proposal for security and cooperation in Europe included acknowledgement of what it called present realities, but only as a starting point for overcoming divisions instead of freezing them as the Soviets wanted. The proposal referred to the UN principles of sovereignty, non-use of violence, non-interference, disarmament, cooperation, and so on and so forth. All European states should participate in a big conference. And so the memorandum did not only represent an independent counterposition to the Soviet plan, but it concurred also in important elements with what the West Germans wanted, namely overcoming the borders between the two Germanys. As was noted in the Foreign Ministry in Germany immediately, Germany had what they called an eminent interest in this proposal, and they wanted to discuss it with the Yugoslavs, and they did. In his numerous meetings with politicians, for instance, German chancellors, but also foreign policy makers like Henry Kissinger, Tito skillfully developed his role as a broker between the blocs and an agent of confidence building, which I can outline here only in a very sketchy way because he had so many contacts and meetings. Tito provided a direct line of communication between the Germans and the US interlocutors and also with the Soviet Union. For instance, he advised Helmut Schmidt on the future CSCE, and he shaped content and rhetoric. For instance, the issue of sovereignty emerged from non-alignment rhetoric, and it was carried to the Helsinki Conference in 1975. Also, the respect for the Charter of United Nations, including the claim for independence and sovereignty of all countries and the banishment of force in international relations, to mention just a couple of aspects which entered the Helsinki process in 1975. And this brings me to my last point, what happened on the international UN level. Because Yugoslavia, all these elements were complementary to one another, and Yugoslavia was a founding member of the UN. It was a non-permanent member of the Security Council after the war, where it advocated for democratization of the United Nations. Yugoslavia presented initiatives for the reform of the Security Council, which it found undemocratic because it represented only the big powers and not the nations. A reform of the Charter, functioning of the General Assembly, and a lot of practical initiatives. Now, the elder literature insists that Yugoslavia's influence at UN level was limited. However, new research shows the opposite. For instance, in the book by Arno Trulj. It was in Yugoslavia's very national interest to limit the overriding influence of the great powers and give newly independent states a greater say. For instance, as regards economic relations. On the initiative of Yugoslavia and other non-aligned states, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the UNCTAD, was established in spite of harsh resistance by the United States and by the European nations in 1964. Within its framework, the developing countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America formed the Group of 77. Yugoslavia played an active role in many sub-organizations. I cannot name them all, from UNCTAD to UNIDO, UNESCO, International Labour Organization, and many others. Favorite themes included peace and disarmament, the further development of international law, the democratization of the UN, and decolonization. Upon Yugoslav initiative, the UN General Assembly passed its Declaration of Principles on Peaceful Coexistence in 1970. And in 1974, it adopted the Declaration on the Establishment of a New International Economic Order. The draft was presented by Egypt, but it was a common initiative by the Group of 77, including Yugoslavia. The New International Economic Order, this initiative called for global fairness in economic relations between developed and developing countries, and it outlined a program for global redistribution of economic welfare. It should be understood that for Yugoslavia, restructuring the world order became a matter of pure survival. During the 1970s, when traditional industries collapsed under the pressure of the third industrial revolution, which ultimately marked the transition of a new type of economy and social model. The post-war boom came to an end in many countries, also in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia had seen immense growth rates after the war, economic miracle, a Wirtschaftswunder, as we call it in Germany, and this came to an end. Mining and heavy industry came under pressure, resulting in a massive loss of production and revenue, growing inflation, and growing job unemployment. Aggravated by bad planning, mismanagement, lack of investment, technological deficits, the terms of trade deteriorated for Yugoslavia. So on the world market, what Yugoslavia and other developing countries, or the developing countries, had to offer became cheaper, and what they wanted to or needed to buy, industrial goods, became very expensive. So the terms of trade worsened, and this motivated countries to push for different type of global economic order. Self-managed Yugoslavia, meanwhile, attempted to offset the loss of income through foreign borrowing, and where this led to, we all know, to over-indebtedness and a big crisis in the 1980s. While in the industrialized Western countries, the state assumed increased powers to steer the economy in response to the crisis, the Yugoslav state did the opposite. The Yugoslav state transferred greater economic responsibility to the regions, to the republics. Since the mid-60s, in the wake of decentralization, the self-management system had been reformed. More functions and competencies have been given to the republics and provinces. A series of constitutional reforms in the early 1970s further extended the rights of these entities vis-à-vis the federal government, and this culminated in 1974 in a new constitution. President Tito was convinced that Yugoslavia's third way, its way of socialism, could serve as a model for the new economic order. In his numerous meetings with international politicians and heads of state, he frequently articulated demands of the Global South. He promoted the project of so-called collective self-reliance and the new economic order, because there were certain similarities between the Yugoslav self-managed system and the project of the new economic order, such as social and economic equality, the elimination of market monopolies, combining market economy and self-management, and other things. The basic idea was to allow self-reliance, which, in contrast to autarky, aimed at establishing a new relationship between developing countries and between developing and industrial countries. Efforts to build a new international economic order inevitably stimulated initiatives for change in the structure of information. Access to unbiased information was seen as a prerequisite for cultural and economic self-determination. But Western countries advocated what they called a free flow of news and information, which meant in practice that the news market was dominated by a small number of large and very powerful media organizations controlled by the West. News agencies in developing countries could not afford foreign correspondents, and thus received a large part of their international news through these big international American and French agencies, and one Soviet with us. Critics therefore argued that the so-called free flow in fact meant a one-way flow of news from the developed to the developing countries, which resulted in hegemonic relationships. And not to forget, in a capitalist system, news is a commodity. It is sold for profit. Complaints referred to the monopoly position of transnational communication corporations, to a lack of respect for third world peoples, also the reproduction of stereotypes, reporting about Africa and Asia focused on coups, violence, and natural catastrophe, and very seldom on achievements by these countries. This negatively affected the image of the new sovereign states. On the other hand, countries were dependent on information produced by Western sources when taking foreign policy and economic decisions. Last but not least, there was new communication technology like satellites, which prompted calls for regulation on an international plane within the United Nations. In 1972, the UNESCO General Conference adopted a resolution on guiding principles on the use of satellites broadcasting for the free flow of information and greater cultural exchange. Initiatives to promote a new global economic and communication order were interrelated. As a trained communist, Josip Broz Tito knew how the media could affect political decisions, how they could govern strategic decisions and influence public opinion. As early in 1943, in the middle of the war, the partisans founded their news agency Tanjug to report on the resistance movement to the outside world. After the war, Tanjug served as a kind of governmental agency, but over time, parallel to the development of self-management reforms, it gained some corporate autonomy and improved output quality. In result, the media in Yugoslavia held a certain degree of independence and broader possibilities of expression than other communist countries. Tito articulated the need for an independent news agency as early as in 1955 when he visited India, when the idea of non-alignment took shape. He stressed that Yugoslavia needed to send more journalists to India and other countries to report about the developing world. By this, he prefigured the discussion on a new world information and communication order by 2 decades. In 1964, Tanjug participated in the establishment of an information exchange program for 5 African non-aligned countries, and it created new links between world and national news agencies. Tanjug invested a significant effort in gathering and distribution of original, foreign news to the newly independent countries. Between 1944 and 1993, it maintained 237 international correspondents in about 60 countries. So there was a huge distribution of Yugoslav journalists all over the world. Because Tanjug sought to represent countries, and also Tanjug sought to represent countries of non-aligned movement specifically, and particularly those with a kind of socialist system. So Tanjug reported from what happened in these non-aligned countries to the Western and to the international world. Tanjug was, for instance, the first agency to report on some key events of the Cold War. A Yugoslav journalist had the last interview with Prime Minister of Congo, Patrice Lumumba, the day before his assassination in 1961 in a coup orchestrated by the CIA and Belgium. Its reports about the assassination were picked up by the media from all over the world. Other scoops included reports on the US Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in Cuba that same year, and the US-aided military coup against Chile's democratically elected President Salvador Allende in 1973. It thus contributed to bringing about first-hand information to the world public, which came from a more or less independent source. The newly independent states, by and large, started by themselves founding new state agencies for news and information. In 1962, there were 23 African nations that had established their own national news agency. 10 years later, there were already 90 sovereign states which possessed such agencies. Still, Western agencies continued to dominate the news market, namely Agence France-Presse, Associated Press, UPI, and Reuters, and there was also TASS. In the mid-70s, the five big news agencies provided between 75% and 97% of international reporting. The reaction was a new initiative in 1975, when 12 members of this news from these newly independent states with their own agency created a news agency pool. And Tanjug became the first coordinator of this pool of non-aligned news agencies called VANAP. This allowed for a multi-channel flow of news reports and information between participating agencies. It also served as a point of reference for the project of a new World Communication Order and the new World Economic Order. By January 1977, more than 40 news agencies in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Europe were contributing to the pool. The seat, in addition, broadcasting organization was established, and the seat was established in Sarajevo. Within a couple of years, non-aligned countries established an independent news organization, including the news agencies, but also broadcasting with Yugoslav organizations and journalists at their center. There were also many training projects, not to forget, to educate, to train journalists from non-aligned countries in Yugoslavia on professional journalism, which was also part of its information strategy. In 1982, Tito already dead, the initiatives continued, and the non-aligned news agency pool agreed with the United Nations on exchange on information From now on, the United Nations circulated the news produced by the independent pool and via their official networks, in addition to those of the 5 big agencies. This meant that authentic information from the non-aligned countries could be made available to all delegations of UN member states and accredited journalists for free. Within a few years, the worldwide information web, consisting of more than 80 news agencies, has been created. This had an impact on the discussions within the United Nations system, in particular in UNESCO. And there's one important document in 1980. This is the so-called UNESCO McBride report, an international expert report analyzing the structure of the world information order in a very critical way. Condemning, I quote, the harmful disparities both between countries and within them, calling for a democratic new world and information and communication order. When the McBride report was presented, Britain and the US walked out of UNESCO in protest, and it took several years for them to return. In the 1980s, and this brings me to the end of my presentation, negotiations about this new world and information order stalled. Economic conditions worsened, both in Yugoslavia and in the so-called Third World. Badly affected by the global debt crisis, Yugoslavia turned her back to the impoverished global South. A wave of globalization spurred by deregulation, privatization, and new information technology resulted in even greater commercialization and concentration of the media sector. In result, developing countries could not substantially change realities on the ground just by controlling new supply, providing missing information, and presenting new images of themselves. This brings me to my conclusion. From today's perspective, outcomes of Yugoslavia's initiatives seem rather modest, apart maybe from German unification, to which it contributed behind the scenes. Yet, also in other areas, Yugoslavia played an important role as a third party. It helped to provide information, lines of communication, and other services between non-aligned countries and between North and South, and also East and West. Tito's Yugoslavia contributed to agenda setting, the European Security Order, numerous initiatives within the UN, not the least new economic order and information order. In the framework of active coexistence, Yugoslavia helped building trust, easing tensions, and reinforcing the mood of detente. This also created legitimacy for Yugoslavia's system and for Tito personally. The global context was immensely important in ensuring that Yugoslavia remained stable for so long. However, the economic and debt crisis in the 1980s, the downfall of communism, the end of the Cold War left little room for any substantial changes of the liberal global economy in the long run. Even before the state collapsed, Yugoslavia's position as a third party was losing relevance. Implementing a new world order could not be achieved against the political will of the big powers. Still, today, as a new multipolar global order is in the making, some key questions that Yugoslavia was setting become very urgent. This concludes my presentation, and I thank you very much for
Thank you very much on this presentation, and we can develop basically all topics mentioned here in different ways. I will at one point open the possibility for people in the audience to ask questions to me and Madam Calic. My name is Tvrtko Jakovina. I'm teaching global history or world history at the University of Zagreb and in Bologna since many years ago already. You started with the so-called naughty agreement between Stalin and Churchill in Moscow, and which is very often connected with the Yalta. Do you think that that was the intention, or that simply all the developments since 1948 led us to 50-50, or that was written in stone in 44, and then since then Yugoslavia was simply doomed to stay in between two parts of Europe?
No, I don't think
Works.
Does it works? Okay. No, of course it was not in stone, and the agreement was never implemented 100% like it was written down. But for Yugoslavia, in a way, it was, because the two sides agreed that it should not belong to either side because it held such a strategic position in the Adriatic, and it was clear the one who would control this country would then control a large part of Europe and of the Eastern Mediterranean and so on and so forth. What I want to say is that Tito understood that the two big players, the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, had an interest in keeping the other side out. And he was playing on this, and he was exploiting the situation. Of course, this could have changed, and he himself was not sure how long the situation would last, but at the end it lasted very long. And he always, when he made his decisions, he thought, okay, the other side will not allow this to happen, and so he could be sure, or he thought he could be sure to do some or take some decisions independently, because he just knew the other ones would, not want to change anything, and also both sides were not willing to risk a big war because of Yugoslavia, so better not change this, what had been agreed in the Second World War. But of course it could have been changed, and it did change in the 1980s when the Cold War ended. Then everything fell down, the whole construction.
If you would have to use a word or two to describe that change after 1940, since 1948, but in the light that we are dealing with a country that was so parochial, so provincial, so on the outskirts, so underdeveloped as a whole, so demolished during the Second World War, unlike some other parts of Europe that were less unfortunate. How would you describe that people who were maybe raised in international, communist internationalist ideology, but nevertheless we know how Stalin was always described as a Europeanist and not seeing actually the rest of the world. Where would you see, or how would you describe that change in the Yugoslav leadership? Was it a pragmatism, or simply being smart, or we were misjudging them and seeing them as too local, or maybe they were never local? How would you see that change that evolved since 48?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, but as I said, Tito had a very clear idea already when he started the war, that for him, for his seizing power and establishing a socialist system, the revolution, he would not be able to do this without considering the international situation. So it was important to get in touch with the British and to discuss with Stalin. Yugoslavia, had it not had the consent, or had it not been in this very specific situation, it would probably not have been able to play such an important role. There were people around him who had, I think, a good understanding of international, how important these international things were, as others were not. Many of them were trained in the Soviet Union, and their horizon was rather limited. But after '48, there was a simple necessity, and in a situation of total isolation, because Yugoslavia was isolated from the West, and then suddenly also from the East. Then the West came and said, okay, we offer you certain military aid, economic, and so on. This was a pragmatic choice. It was not something planned long-term ahead, and from there, things developed. I don't think it was a long-term strategic plan, but it was a quite smart way of exploiting a situation and understanding where the chances lay, and also where the risks were.
And you know, at the same time, when you talk of small countries, they either bandwagon behind the great powers or try to stay below the radar. When Stalin died in 1953, Finland hardly published anything about Stalin's death, let alone criticized. At the same time, in February 1953, Edvard Kardelj, who was allegedly #2 in Yugoslavia, compared Stalin to Hitler directly. And you know, in 1952, American ambassador became persona non grata for comparing the atmosphere in Moscow with atmosphere in Berlin during the Hitler or Nazi era. So the Yugoslavs had something else. It was not just a pragmatic or smart way of looking, but there was a stubbornness or being brave, or, you know, pushing the limits, I would say, for a small country, something that wasn't so common in the history of 20th century or mankind.
Yeah, that's true. It wasn't common. It was also not expected. I mean, everyone was very surprised what happened. But Yugoslavia was not common in that it was successful in this resistance movement and the partisan struggle, and in that Tito had a very strong position in his party, in the Communist Party, and in the country as the one leader who had made this struggle a success, and who was recognized as an official ally internationally. There were no other communist leader all over Europe who was in such a strong position as Tito was. He had not really opponent. They were eliminated after the war. So he could be very self-confident that when he grasped power, that he wanted to keep it. So by all means.
The formation of the non-aligned, or the whole idea, became, and I personally was always having a hard time explaining that it was not non-European policy. On the contrary, that made Yugoslavia very active, as you showed, not only in the context of Central Europe and German question, but in general in the 70s, in the context of the United Nations. From the economical point of view, for a country that was so poor at the beginning, that is, if you could dwell on that, you know. So it was not only knowledge or information as you described here, but you have economy, and we can talk about culture also that was being explored and so on.
Yeah, it had many dimensions. There were many students coming to Yugoslavia and studying, I don't know, all kinds of from medicine to technology, engineers learning Serbian or Croatian or whatever language. It was an investment in economic terms, but it had an outcome, not only also economically, but because Yugoslavia invested in these countries, and although, I mean, it gave a lot of development aid, much of that came from debts which it had taken from other countries, but in a way it repaid in other terms in the long term in it having these good relations and gaining this influence on in other areas.
Who was there with Tito? How would you see that hierarchy, or who was behind the whole idea of from your recent or research? You know, the self-management or non-aligned or approach vis-a-vis some serious questions in Europe and so on.
He had his team, and there were different players, and I know you are best placed to answer this. You have studied and interviewed some of them and even written books. So of course this was not just in Tito's, but he had a very skillful team of diplomats and trained people who were ambassadors ambassador in Germany and others who helped design this kind of policy. So of course this was not Tito himself, but tell you are here.
No, but
you as well.
Starting from the introduction and the whole aura around Tito, you have someone who could be argued that he was brutal in certain phases of his life and so on, but at the same time, someone who was obviously able to develop a very skillful policy vis-a-vis the United States, and then to insist on certain benchmarks with vis-a-vis the Soviets, who waited and then became the first one to go to Mao's mausoleum in China after Mao died. It seems, and that's connected with one of my previous questions, it seems not regular behavior, I would say, or most of the people from this part of the world. Do you see that as something that was above all other policies we had and all other problems that existed in Yugoslavia, between different republics, between the way how nationalities issue was being solved, between the internal development of Yugoslavia? Or you could see that as a logical, was it a part, the foreign policy, or seemingly a part, or was it an integral part of the Yugoslav development?
It was an integral part of the Yugoslav development because these things were all interconnected. I gave this example of the economic order, how the Yugoslav reforms in the 1960s were somehow transposed to this, or there was at least efforts to transposing this to the global level and to learn of this. Maybe it's good that we did not learn from this experience, but I would not say it was such a separated, but you know probably better than I do, a separate sector. I read in one of the minutes about when Helmut Schmidt talked to Tito, and they talked, and like Schmidt wanted to learn from him, and then he said, President, how much time do you dedicate to foreign policy on a day? And Tito goes, I start in the morning, I read 2 hours, I read all the newspapers and reports, and this is foreign policy, and then I do other things. So for him, apparently was very important, but not the only concern. Yeah.
Partially that's connected with when you mentioned in the 70s and the all changes that were coming during the detente. I mean, even the way how Yugoslav-Italian border was finally settled. It will be the anniversary next year in Osimo. That was given to the republics. I mean, the Slovenes had an enormous influence while negotiating in 75, and that was in tune with the reforms that Yugoslavia was going through.
Yeah, exactly. So it's maybe a problem if we look only in one sector of this complex country, like only self-management, or only these things could not function without the other elements. So, and this constant process of regionalization and decentralization, which was a big issue from the 60s onwards, were mirrored in this foreign policy, and this may be an argument which I did not make in this lecture, but I think it is. The policy that Yugoslavia had good relations in all directions and different systems and cultures was a stabilizing factor, because Yugoslavia had good relations with the Arab world, it had good relations with the West, with the Soviet Union. So everyone, whatever you might be in cultural terms and political terms, might have found an ally or neighbor to have a good relation with. So even Albania, I mean, for the Kosovo, Albania sent school books and teachers and whatever. So there was this a benefit for many people for a while. Then not anymore in the 1970s, probably, and not in the 80s, but for a certain while, there was a gain for people and for other sectors as well.
If you would have to say, well, these were bad decisions, or they shouldn't have done this or that.
No, I'm not doing this, because I'm a historian. I'm not, I'm not replacing the decision maker.
Well, I had the Hallstein doctrine in mind. So would you, if you were in Belgrade, would you? Tito allegedly said, well, or Kocha Popovic allegedly said, well, one had to do that one day, or it wasn't so illogical. But
yeah, but the Hallstein, I mean, the Germans were unhappy with their own doctrine. I mean, they had the Hallstein doctrine, so they had to isolate Yugoslavia and cut off diplomatic relation, but they were very unhappy about that. So they found other ways of communicating culture, economy, and so on. So Hallstein was something, it had to be done, but everybody knew that was not the smartest idea to implement the Hallstein doctrine. So, and Tito, okay, got the prize. He made a prize for lifting the sanctions. So.
That's true. Recently, I've been talking with a colleague of ours from Florida. And she told me that there is a huge problem she has. She needs to explain to those who are giving her money that European history is important and worth studying. So you've been at one of the top places in the United States, world, and you teach at one of top places in arguably the most important European country. How would you see not only European history as a field, but also Southeast European history today or in the future?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is what I witnessed in Harvard as well, in the United States, as European history is marginalized totally. Not totally, but it's largely marginalized. German history is virtually non-existent. Balkan history is non-existent. I was, like the only one who lectured or researched there. There is now much interest in global history, post-colonial studies, also cultural history, which makes that topics I'm interested in, like international relations or economic, social trends are less studied. This is very strong in the United States, and it's also true for Germany to a certain extent. We still have strong focus on Eastern Europe and also Southeastern Europe, but there are few universities dealing with these countries, the region, however we call it. I mean, Hannes Granditz is here in Berlin, one, Munich is one, Regensburg, but apart from that, there is not much. And so we managed to preserve the chair. So when I will retire in some years, not soon, but some, so the chair will remain. But I'm not sure about other universities. So, and there is constant interest, I think, in Europe and Germany, particular in this area. Germany has a very active policy towards the region since the 80s, 70s, but also during the war in the 1990s, now in the Western Balkan thing, the Berlin process and all of that. Germany is very active, so there is a constant interest in Germany for that. But whether it translates really in funding for research projects and exchanges and so, I'm not so sure, but I hope so. I'm working for it.
And the majority of interviews you gave, at least those that are listed under your name at the university in Munich, deal with Bosnia and Kosovo. So that is what has to be wrapped up, and then will Germany cease to be interested in Southeastern Europe, or that's not going to happen anytime soon, but nevertheless, just imagine, are these bad news or good news? So if the region comes down, what will that mean for the historical research?
Well, I hope that, I mean, it's natural that the public is interested in conflicts and Kosovo and Bosnia and so, but when the region calms down, it will probably also come closer to the European Union, and the whole process of integration and exchanges will accelerate or improve, so that it becomes more natural to talk about the region and certain countries, hopefully also about Bosnia and Kosovo, as not as conflict countries, but as partners in our systems. We have in Germany by BIHOST a program giving fellowships for doctoral students from the region. I have one from Croatia, I have from Serbia, one from Montenegro. So this creates a certain exchange of our scientific systems, and I hope that this will continue.
Yeah, it's not just about you, it's also about us in the region, how to remain interesting and important, I would say. Maybe. But
I think that the region has become a part of many in the literature I see. It is not so much treated any longer as an exotic area, and also in these international things, as I mentioned, when people are writing about global something, then they are also looking at this area, and this is an achievement in a way, I think.
Yeah. No, I mean, in that sense, in the sense of globalizing world, non-aligned could offer a space for the future research and remaining important or interesting to the rest of the world, I would say. I could open the floor for the audience now, so if there are questions. When I'm in Zagreb, then I always say that if there are no questions, don't take it personally. That's how it works with the students. But I see 3 older colleagues here, so go ahead.
Well, thanks. Bonjour. I have a rather unusual question, maybe. U slovenščini. Ja, pravijo naj govorim u slovenščini. Upam, da boste razumeli.
I will translate if she does.
Okay. It does. I will speak in English anyway. Okay, two aspects of this new economic order and new media, they are very interesting for us. That's something we not think a lot in this way, observing foreign policy of Tito and Yugoslavia. Is it possible to make some comparisons with, I said it's a bit unusually, with China today? I think not in the terms of power, of course, but of the concept. The China has a third world similar concept of somehow not interrupting, but penetrating in it, but also about media. Is it any connection we can see here?
I don't think so, because China's strategy has a different aim, and also other instruments. This road and belt initiative, which brings so much money and investment and credits to this region, but also to other regions in Africa, Latin America, all over the place, is one which aims to bring benefit to China as a hegemonic force, as the world leader in some years to come. China wants to be the only world power in, I don't know how many years or decades, and the difference is in that, also through media and social media, all this investment by the Chinese. I still understand the Yugoslav project not as one governing the world or becoming the new superpower and the only one, but to giving other countries a stronger voice and sharing interest. The country was much smaller. It was insignificant, as you said, after 40 destroyed. I mean, China is a rising star in all terms. So I don't think this... it's a different nature. One is gaining hegemony in a one polar world, or in a world where China is at least one big player, or maybe the biggest one. What do you think?
Is China the most important in Africa?
No,
or
whether you can compare.
I couldn't, because the size is simply different, and we, even if we wanted to do everything, we couldn't. But certain things that I recently observed or experienced, it's I wrote an article, I don't know whether that was seen, but I was approached by a man from Rijeka whose name is Velimir Rothschild. His parents were and then I asked in the Jewish community, are there Rothschilds in Croatia? And they didn't know, but that's another story. He was working in Yugo-Ethiopia enterprise that was established in 1954 in Asmara, and they lived in Asmara, and then in Addis Ababa in 1954, which was a capitalist enterprise. 100%, a department store selling Yugoslav goods in Ethiopia, 9 years after the end of the Second World War. I was pretty amazed by that. But then you had Zagrebačka Prvomajska, a company that had a joint venture in Mexico and then in Chile. And then Tito, who was the first European leader to visit Panama, but he went to Panama because we built, after the Panama Canal, the largest dam and the largest project that was ever built in that country since the Panama Canal. Taking into account the size and workers who were not always very happy to go to work far away, telling that there are places in Yugoslavia enough, and why do we have to go to Gabon and here and there. That was rather impressive, I have to say. And then this year we were remembering, or Europe was remembering the coronation revolution in Portugal. I mean, since 1974, Portuguese presidents and prime ministers were constantly visiting Yugoslavia, 3 of them came, but Tito was in touch with the leaders of the socialist, not communist, socialist opposition that were in Germany, Mario Soares, and also the Spanish Felipe González, who were coming as the exiles to Yugoslavia to deal with Yugoslavs, prior to the change in these countries. That is, I mean, I don't think that you see that coming from a small country in spite of the globalist approach and policy of a small country, and that is, although in the context of Croatia I would be immediately labeled as Titoist for saying this, but this is not something that you can find very often, A guide of my tour in Peru said, "Oh yes, Yugoslavia, Tito. He was here, and Yugoslavia was building another dam in the northern Peru, which is." From the economical point of view, I don't think that was money wasted, but also, from the political point of view, it is still there. Okay, we cannot use it in different ways, but Germans who are now seeing that there is a 20-year opportunity to bring as many educated Latin Americans to Germany as possible. And they are doing that, because in 20 years' time, and I'm quoting one of the German diplomats there, that window of opportunity will be closed. They are using all the connections they have, We also have problems, Slovenia less, but also have problems with demography. You could use things like that, we don't do that. We cannot do that for different Croatia, for different reasons. It can't be anything positive what happened in Yugoslavia, but that's a different thing, But it was rather amazing, I would say. 2 more questions we will take.
Much of the discussion and your lecture brings me to a question that I would like to hear your opinion. How much did Tito's personality color his foreign policy? Because we've heard, he read the newspapers, the foreign policy rubric for 2 hours. He loved to travel. He met various people. Was greeted as a big guest. How much do you think that influenced his foreign policy? Because also with Willy Brandt, because both of them were bon vivants in their own ways, I think they understood each other on a personal level.
Brandt drank more than Tito.
Sorry?
Brandt drank more than Tito.
yeah. As I said, they were all both vivants in their own way. So, how much do you think that aspect of his personality influenced his foreign political activity, so to say?
And Mitias?
Thank you. Actually, Tito and Yugoslavia's foreign policy utilized the concept of soft power before the concept was even developed. And it was incredibly interesting how some of these elements are now copied by great powers worldwide, and also by some smaller countries, but to a much lesser extent than it was the case with the former Yugoslavia. However, my main question would be, how do you think new international economic order and new international information order are still accurate and important at today's stage of world's development, particularly considering the recent developments in Ukraine, Gaza, and in other countries which are facing wars?
You mean how many news from Sudan we get from Sudanese broadcasts and platforms?
Exactly, yeah. And for example, now from Gaza, now that Al Jazeera was closed there, and it's the same in other cases as well.
Okay, maybe the last question, someone else, some of the students? The bravest of the students?
You should stop. Okay, let me answer the personality. I would say the personality was very important, but in a different way than you alleged. Tito was coming from a peasant family. He was uneducated, and he suffered basically all his life from this complex that not being educated, and he was trying when he was a young man to compensate, and he read and read and wrote, and he saw his notes in the archive when he did the summaries of books. And I think for him it was a big or I should say that he became an important statesman was really an achievement for him. It was not in his biography from the very beginning that, how would you say that such a boy from a peasant family in the countryside becomes, you know, a world leader. Yes, he liked life, he liked good life, and so, but he understood how to deal with other people. When I studied his relationship with Churchill, it was very interesting because Churchill considered Tito as one of these, you know, yes, you know, bandit in there. What the hell is he? And he treated him like this. And during the war, when Tito came to talk to him. But then after the war, Tito became a respected politician, and there is one picture, a photograph, which is very telling. It's not in this book, I think, and not in the Slovenian one, where Churchill is already old, and Tito takes him and helps him to, you know, to...
Yeah, that's in Split.
And so I found this telling because he, you know, he still understood how to treat people and how to tell, so he could find the right way of communicating with Brandt, but also with, I don't know, Haile Selassie or whoever he met. So this was in his personality, if you wish, and he had this sense of, if he wanted to. So I must say he did not always want to. So, and the second question, yes, I think it's very topical, the two, but in different ways, because the things have changed also in communication. I mean, it's true, we see this flows of news being produced, and it's getting ever worse with the social media and the internet, and with AI we don't even know which pictures are true and which are not. So I think there is a big need of regulation, of communication, and also of economic relations. Maybe not the same way it is framed, and you know, this needs to be adapted to the new circumstances. But I really think this is more urgent than ever.
Hopefully something will happen with the reform of the United Nations that was promised again this year. We are heading, maybe. We'll see what will happen after the elections in the United States. Okay, with this I will wind this conversation up, and thank you, Madame Calic, for your lecture and the presentation, and thank you all in the audience. Thanks.